The rifle came up before Roy Ramsey had both boots planted in the yard, and he found himself staring down the twin dark eyes of a shotgun sight held steady by a woman who did not look like she had ever missed anything she aimed at in her life. "You take one more step toward that barn, Sheriff, and you will explain yourself to my husband's God before you explain yourself to me." Edith Maddox stood on the porch of the low log house with her late husband's Winchester braced against her shoulder, her dark hair loose from its pins, a shawl thrown crooked over a nightdress she had not had time to change out of. Behind her, framed in the doorway, her older boy Daniel stood pale and furious, 16 years old and trying very hard to look like a man in front of his mother. "Mrs. Maddox." Roy kept his hands where she could see them, away from his own sidearm, palms out the way he had learned to do it long before he ever pinned on a star. "I am not here to hurt anybody. I have got a warrant and I mean to serve it proper, but I would rather talk first." "You have got a lie," Edith said. "Somebody's lie, dressed up nice in a warrant. My son has never touched a steer that was not ours in his whole life, and you know it, or you would know it if you troubled yourself to look." It was late June of 1878, and the moon over Gideon's Crossing was fat and low and orange behind the canyon rim, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already on fire before the sun even thought about rising. Roy had ridden 2 hours from town on word brought by Silas Colton's foreman, a lean man named Enos Pratt, who swore he had found a Colton steer wearing a badly reworked brand grazing not a quarter mile from the Maddox fence line, with young Daniel Maddox's own boot prints, so Enos claimed, pressed fresh in the mud beside it. "Ma'am, I have got a dead steer with a rocking sea brand burned over into something that could pass for your bar M if a man did not look too close," Roy said. "I am not saying your boy did it. I am saying I have got to ask him, and I have got to look, because that is the job the town pays me for." "The job Silas Colton pays you for," Edith said, and something in the way she said it made Roy's jaw tighten, because it was not entirely wrong and both of them knew it. Colton and 4 other ranchers had put up the money that got Roy elected the summer before, money for a proper jail and a proper office, and a salary that let a man live without starving, and everybody in the canyon knew whose voice carried furthest in Roy Ramsey's ear when trouble came. "I have not always liked what that job asks of me," Roy said quietly, "but I have never yet hung an innocent boy to keep it easy. Let me look at the brand myself before I do anything else. 3 days. Give me 3 days to find out who really cut that steer, and if it comes back on your Daniel after all, I will do what the law requires, and you will not have to point that rifle at me to make sure I am fair about it." The gun did not waver, not right away. Edith studied him the way, Roy would learn later, she studied everything before she trusted it, the way a woman looks at light before she decides whether it is worth burning a glass plate to catch it. 3 days, she said finally, and lowered the rifle an inch, though not all the way down. "And if you come back here with Enos Pratt riding at your shoulder instead of alone, I will assume the worst of you, Sheriff, and I will not apologize for it." "Fair," Roy said, and meant it, and turned his horse back toward town before either of them could say anything else that might crack the fragile truce wide open. He did not sleep that night. He kept seeing her on that porch, rifle steady, chin up. Not one bit of fear in her, though she was a widow alone with 2 boys and a hired man's worth of livestock standing between her family and whatever Silas Colton wanted from this canyon. The town of Gideon's Crossing sat where the only bridge for 11 miles spanned the gorge of the Vermilion River, a narrow planken cable crossing that Silas Colton had helped pay to build a decade back, and had collected a toll on ever since through a company he called, without much shame, the Vermilion Bridge and Ferry Association. When the spring melt ran the river too high and fast for the bridge deck to be trusted, Colton's ferryman pulled a flatboat across for double the bridge toll, and there was no other legal way over that gorge for a wagon within a full day's ride in either direction. Every rancher who wanted to ship cattle to the railhead at Larkspur, Every family who wanted to reach the circuit judge or the land office went through Gideon's Crossing, and through whatever mood Silas Colton happened to be in that week. Roy had grown up poor on the far side of that river, had watched his own father lose a small herd to a hard winter and a worse loan, and he had told himself when he ran for sheriff that he would use whatever power the badge gave him to make sure that never happened to another family if he could help it. It was harder in practice than it had sounded in the speeches. He rode out to Colton's ranch house the next morning to ask about the brand and found Enos Pratt sitting on the porch rail like he had been waiting. Sheriff, Enos had a way of saying the word that made it sound like an insult. Mr. Colton figured you would come sniffing around instead of just doing your job. My job is to be sure before I arrest a boy, Roy said. Where exactly did you find that steer? Told you already. Maddox land near the fence. Show me the fence line. Show me the ground it was standing on. Enos's eyes flickered just barely toward the house, where Silas Colton had appeared in the doorway, a heavy-set man with white hair and the unhurried confidence of somebody who had never once in his life worried about where his next meal was coming from. Roy, Colton said, coming down the steps with his hand out, though Roy did not take it. No need to make more of this than it is. Boy's mother is a good woman, hard worker, but she has got 2 sons and no husband and a debt this county has been kind enough to overlook on account of her circumstances. Sometimes desperate people do desperate things. Take the boy in, let the judge sort it when he comes through in the fall, and everybody can go back to their lives. Fall is 4 months off, Roy said. You want me to hold a 16-year-old boy in that jail for 4 months on the word of your own foreman? I want you to remember who put you in that office, Colton said, and though his voice stayed easy, there was iron underneath it now, plain as a blade under silk. I have been patient with you, Roy. I would hate for that patience to wear thin before harvest. Roy rode away from the Colton ranch with his stomach in a knot, because he understood, clearer than he wanted to, that the debt Colton spoke of was as real a threat to him as it was to Edith Maddox, and that a man could lose his badge just as easy as a widow could lose her land. If the wrong people decided, he was no longer useful. He went to look at the fence line himself instead of taking anybody's word for it, and what he found there troubled him more than anything Enos Pratt had said. The ground near the Maddox fence was hard and dry, cracked from 3 weeks without rain, and there were no boot prints at all, fresh or otherwise. Only the drag marks of a dead animal that had clearly been hauled there, not walked there on its own 4 legs. Somebody had killed that steer somewhere else, altered its brand after the fact when a fresh brand would not have healed and would have shown scarring inconsistent with an old theft, and dragged the carcass onto Maddox land to be found. It was, Roy thought, riding back toward Gideon's Crossing with the sun already climbing hot and bright over the canyon rim, either the clumsiest frame job he had ever seen, or somebody had been in an almighty hurry, and hurry usually meant somebody was afraid of something. He did not yet know what. He would. 2 days into the 3 he had promised, Roy rode back out to the Maddox Place meeting to tell Edith what he had found, and arrived to a scene of such chaos that, for 1 bad second, his hand went to his pistol before he understood what he was looking at. Daniel was shouting. A neighbor woman, Mrs. Alvarez from the next claim over, was laughing and crying at the same time. And in the middle of the yard, mud to his elbows and grinning so wide it looked like it might split his face in 2, stood 10-year-old Charlie Maddox holding out both hands like he was presenting the crown jewels of some foreign kingdom, and in his cupped palms, catching the morning sun, lay a scatter of raw gold, some of it in flakes, some in nuggets the size of a man's thumbnail. "Ma!" Charlie was shouting, though his mother was standing not 6 feet from him. "Ma, I found it at the bend, right where old man Tucker gave up looking years back, right where everybody said it was panned clean. I found it behind the roots of the big dead cottonwood where the bank slid after the rain." Edith had gone very still, the way Roy had seen deer go still when they first caught a strange scent on the wind, and it was only when he swung down from his horse that she seemed to remember he was there at all. "Sheriff," she said, and her voice was strange, caught somewhere between joy and fear. "I do not suppose there is any chance you rode out here deaf, dumb, and blind this morning." "I rode out here to tell you I found no boot prints and no honest trail on that dead steer," Roy said slowly, looking at the gold in Charlie's hands. "Which means somebody hauled it onto your land to make your Daniel look guilty of something he never did. But I am starting to think that steer was never really about a steer at all. Widow's Bend, as the old-timers called it, on account of nobody quite remembering which widow, had been picked over by every serious placer miner in the canyon a decade before and pronounced dead as a doornail. Grown men with pans and rockers and years of hard experience had walked away from that stretch of the Vermilion with empty pokes and sore backs, certain there was nothing left in that gravel worth a man's time. It had taken a spring flood 2 weeks back, high enough to tear loose a section of bank that had held its secret undisturbed since before the war, and a restless 10-year-old boy too curious and too small to know better than to go poking around where his elders had already declared failure, to find what all of them had missed. "If word of this gets to Colton before you have filed a claim," Roy said, crouching down to look closer without touching, "there will not be a fence high enough or a rifle steady enough to keep him off this land. He controls the only bridge out of this canyon. If he decides your family's claim belongs to him instead, he does not even have to steal it outright. He just has to make it too hard and too dangerous for you to ever prove it is yours." Edith looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes, some calculation settling into place. "Then I suppose," she said, "you and I are going to have to get to the land office in Larkspur before Silas Colton's foreman finishes his breakfast." Roy had expected an argument when he suggested that Daniel and Charlie stay behind with Mrs. Alvarez while he and Edith rode for the county seat, and he got one, though not the one he had braced for. "I'm not some parcel you are shipping across the river for safekeeping, Sheriff," Edith said, tying off the straps on a bundle that Roy was startled to see included, alongside a change of clothes and a wrapped revolver that had clearly belonged to her husband, a heavy wooden case and a folded wooden tripod. "If we are going to Larkspur, I am bringing my camera. I intend to photograph the claim boundary, the bend, the cottonwood roots, all of it dated and clear, so that no clerk in that land office can pretend later he does not know exactly what ground we are talking about. A photograph does not lie the way a ledger can be made to." It was, Roy had to admit as he watched her load the heavy glass plates into their protective case with the careful economy of long practice, a smarter idea than anything he had thought of himself. "You have done this before," he said. "The photographing, I mean. 3 years now." She did not look up from her work. "I have taken portraits of half the families in this canyon, and pictures of the new schoolhouse in Larkspur, and the flood damage on the lower road 2 springs back that got the county to finally build a proper culvert. My husband thought it a strange way for a woman to spend her time. My husband is 2 years in his grave and cannot tell me any more what a strange way to spend my time looks like." There was no bitterness in it, only a plain, tired honesty that made Roy feel he had been let a little further inside her thinking than she usually allowed strangers. "How did he die?" Roy asked, "if you do not mind my asking." "Rockslide up on the old Sentinel claim, 2 years back this September." Edith latched the camera case shut. "He and 2 other men were working a shaft that had been declared worthless by every geologist who ever looked at it. The mountain came down on him before he could prove them wrong. Silas Colton bought the claim off his estate for almost nothing 3 months later, called it a kindness to a grieving widow." She looked up then, and her eyes were dry, but there was something old and hard in them. "I have wondered more than once whether that mountain had help coming down when it did." Roy did not have an answer for that, not yet, but he filed it away in the same place he had put the dragged steer and the missing boot prints, in a growing pile of things about Silas Colton that did not add up to an honest man. The road to Larkspur ran 12 miles along the canyon rim before it dropped down to cross the Vermilion Bridge, and another 8 beyond that through good grazing country to the county seat. A full day's ride if the weather held, which in that golden stretch of June it did, the sky a hard, clean blue with hardly a cloud to mark it. They crossed the bridge just past midday, Roy paying the toll out of his own pocket over Edith's protest, the boards ringing hollow under their horses' hooves above a river running low and green and lazy far below. "Colton's man at the toll house will remember we crossed together," Edith said once they were on the far side, glancing back at the small shack where a bored-looking youth had taken their coin without much interest. "That will get back to him by supper." "Let it," Roy said. "I would rather he hear it from an honest toll collector than have to wonder what else we are hiding." They made camp that night in a stand of aspen a few miles short of Larkspur, close enough to reach the town by mid-morning, far enough from any road that a fire would not draw notice. Roy built it small and careful, the way a man does who has slept out under enough skies to respect what fire could do to dry summer grass, and Edith set up her tripod nearby, not to photograph anything in the dark but simply, she said, because it comforted her to have it standing ready, like a good dog that did not need to be doing anything to be worth keeping close. "You are good with that fire," she observed, settling onto a folded blanket across from him. "Careful. My husband never built one that did not throw sparks halfway to the next county. I spent some years riding for an outfit that drove cattle up from Texas," Roy said. "A man learns fast how a grass fire can undo 6 weeks of driving in about 6 minutes if he is careless with his coffee flame on a windy night. Is that where you learned to be a lawman too?" "No." Roy turned a stick over in the coals, watching the sparks climb. "That came later. I had a brother older than me, name of Ellis. He got himself on the wrong side of a range dispute up near Cheyenne. Took a bullet for standing where the wrong man told him not to stand, and nobody was ever made to answer for it, because the man who did the shooting had money enough to buy the sheriff and the judge both. I decided somewhere around his grave that I would rather be the kind of lawman that money could not buy, even if it meant money would never much like me." Edith was quiet for a moment, watching him with an expression he could not quite read in the firelight. "And yet Silas Colton's money put that badge on your chest," she said, not unkindly, more as if she were turning a puzzle piece in her hand to see how it fit. "It did," Roy admitted. "I told myself I could take a man's money to fund an election and still refuse to take his orders once I had it. I am starting to understand that is a harder trick to manage than I gave it credit for being." "Then do not manage it alone," Edith said. "I have spent 2 years managing everything alone, Sheriff Ramsey, and I can tell you it wears a person thinner than any amount of honest work ever did." It was the closest either of them came, that first night, to saying anything that sounded like the beginning of something, and Roy lay awake a long while after the fire had burned to embers, listening to the aspen leaves whispering overhead and thinking that he had never in his life met a woman who unsettled and steadied him in the exact same breath, the way Edith Maddox did. Larkspur in the golden morning light looked like exactly what it was, a prosperous little county seat grown fat on cattle money, and the railroad spur that had reached it 3 years before, its main street lined with false-fronted stores, and a 2-story brick courthouse that would not have looked out of place in a much larger town. Roy and Edith found the land office tucked behind the courthouse, run by a nervous, ink-stained clerk named Otis Renfrew who went pale the moment Edith mentioned Widow's Bend. "That parcel," Renfrew said, shuffling through a drawer of records with hands that were not quite steady, "that parcel is recorded as encumbered, ma'am. There is a lien filed against the Maddox homestead, dated 18 months back, in favor of the Colton estate, for an unpaid debt in the amount of $400. Edith's face went carefully blank in the way Roy was learning meant she was working very hard to control herself. "My husband owed Silas Colton no such debt," she said. "We owed nothing to any man when Tom died. I kept our books myself, Mr. Renfrew, every penny of them, and I would remember $400. I only file what comes across my desk, ma'am, Renfrew said unhappily. The lien is signed with your late husband's mark, witnessed by Mr. Colton's foreman, a Mr. Pratt. My husband could write his own name plain as any schoolteacher, Edith said. He never signed with a mark in his life. Roy leaned over the counter to look at the document Renfrew produced, and there it was, a shaky X where a signature should have been, witnessed in a cramped hand that Roy recognized, with a cold drop in his stomach, as belonging to Enos Pratt, the same man who had sworn out the warrant against Daniel over the altered steer. "This is forged," Roy said. "Look at the ink, Mr. Renfrew. It is fresher than the date on this page has any right to be. I want a copy of this lien, and I want it noted in your ledger that the Maddox claim on Widow's Bend, filed today under Charlie Maddox's discovery, is contested pending investigation of this document's authenticity." It took the better part of the afternoon, arguing patiently through Renfrew's obvious fear of angering Silas Colton, but by the time the sun was dropping toward the western ridges, Roy had a filed claim in Edith's name as the boy's guardian, a formal challenge lodged against the fraudulent lien, and a promise, extracted with some difficulty, that the circuit judge, due through Larkspur within the month on his regular rounds, would hear the matter as a priority. They rode partway back toward Gideon's Crossing before making camp a second night, both of them worn thin with the strange mixture of triumph and dread that came from knowing they had won a battle while the war had barely begun. "He is going to know by now," Edith said, staring into the fire. "Colton. He will have heard we crossed to Larkspur, and he will guess why soon enough if he has not already." "Probably," Roy agreed. "What happens to you when this is done?" "When the judge rules and Colton loses his lien and his lie about Daniel falls apart. He funded your election. He will not forgive you for standing against him." "I have thought about that some," Roy admitted. "I expect I will lose the office one way or another. Maybe the town council finds some pretext to remove me before the judge even rules. Maybe Colton just buys the next election outright and I am voted out clean and legal in the fall. That does not frighten you." "It frightens me plenty," Roy said, and found, saying it aloud to her in the dark, that it was easier to admit than he would have guessed. "I like being sheriff, Mrs. Maddox. Not the part where men like Colton think they own me, but the part where a widow with 2 boys can look at me across a rifle sight and I can earn my way, slow, into being somebody she trusts instead of somebody she has to shoot. I would hate to lose that." Edith looked at him for a long moment across the small fire, and something in her face softened in a way he had not seen before, not the careful control she wore like armor, but something warmer underneath it. "You are already somebody I trust, Roy Ramsey," she said quietly. "I do not know when exactly that happened. Somewhere between the rifle and the land office, I expect." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, both too mindful, Roy suspected, of everything still balanced on the edge of a knife. But he carried the warmth of those words with him the whole ride home, like a coal kept alive in his pocket against the cold. They found Gideon's Crossing changed when they rode back in 2 days later, the way a town changes when a rumor has had time to grow legs and run wild through every kitchen and saloon between the church and the livery. Word of gold at Widow's Bend had spread, as such word always does, faster than any rider could carry it, and with it had spread a second rumor, uglier and more carefully aimed, that the sheriff had ridden off alone with the widow Maddox for 2 nights on the road to Larkspur, and that a man did not do such a thing for free. "They are saying you fixed the land office records for her," Roy's deputy, a steady young man named Silas Beckwith, who had the misfortune of sharing a first name with the very rancher causing all the trouble, told him grimly the moment he stepped through the office door. "Saying you are sweet on the widow and mean to steal the gold claim out from under her boy once the fuss dies down. Enos Pratt has been buying drinks at the Bull's Head all week, telling anybody who will listen." "None of that is true," Roy said. though he felt his ears go hot all the same, because the part about being sweet on the widow was not so far from true as he would have liked, even if the rest of it was pure poison. "Doesn't much matter if it is true, Roy," Beckwith said. "Town council's meeting tomorrow night. Colton's put it about that they ought to consider whether you are fit to hold the badge given, and I am quoting him here, given your compromised judgment regarding certain parties." The council met in the back room of the general store. 7 men crowded around a table under a hissing lamp, and Silas Colton sat among them like he owned the chairs they were sitting in, which, in a manner of speaking, he did, having loaned money to at least 4 of the 7 at one time or another. "Nobody is accusing the sheriff of anything improper," Colton said smoothly. Once the meeting had ground its way to the point everybody already knew was coming. "We are simply concerned, as responsible men of this town, that a lawman ought to maintain a certain distance from parties involved in an active legal dispute. The Maddox woman has a lien against her, contested though it may be, and a claim worth God knows how much sitting unguarded on her land. It does not look right, Sheriff, you spending nights alone on the road with her." "I spent those nights making sure a forged document did not steal a 10-year-old boy's discovery out from under him," Roy said, keeping his voice level though his blood was up. "I would do it again tomorrow." "Nobody doubts your intentions," said Ferris Yates, who ran the mercantile and owed Colton for the shelving in his store. "But intentions are not the issue, Sheriff. Appearances matter in a town this size." It was Edith herself who ended the meeting, arriving unannounced in the doorway with her camera case in hand, and a stack of glass plate photographs pressed flat between boards under her arm, Charlie trailing behind her looking scared but determined. And behind him, to Roy's considerable surprise, half a dozen small ranchers from up the canyon whom Roy recognized as men who had lost stock over the past 2 years to unexplained shortfalls in their tallies at gather time. "Before you decide whether my presence has compromised the sheriff's judgment," Edith said, setting her case down on the council table with a thump that made the lamp flicker, "perhaps you would like to see what his judgment has actually accomplished." She spread 3 photographs across the table. One showed the dead steer as it had been found, the reworked brand plain and ugly under the harsh flash of her powder. One showed Enos Pratt at Widow's Bend 3 days prior, rifle half raised, threatening Daniel and Charlie off land they had already legally claimed, caught in the exact instant of his own bad temper. The third showed the forged lien document itself, photographed page by page in the Larkspur Land office with Otis Renfrew's own trembling signature attesting to its irregularity. "I have been documenting this canyon for 3 years, Edith said into the silence that followed. "Barns, brands, faces, floods. I have photographs going back 2 full seasons of cattle tallies at gather time that do not match the counts these small ranchers were paid for. Gentlemen, because Mr. Colton's brand inspectors have a habit of losing count in ways that always seem to favor the rocking sea, I did not bring my camera to Larkspur to protect a romance, Mr. Yates. I brought it because a photograph does not care whose money built this council table. The rancher nearest Colton, a weathered man named Hollis Greer who had lost 11 head the previous fall to what he had been told was wolves, leaned forward to study the photographs with a slow, dawning fury. "That is my brand," he said, tapping the image of the reworked steer. "That bar M is not a Maddox brand at all if you look close. That is my old /H worked over twice, once into a rocking sea and then again, sloppy, when somebody needed it to look like it belonged to the Maddox place instead. Somebody has been running my cattle through the rocking sea books for 2 years and I never once thought to question the count." Colton's composure did not crack, not entirely, but Roy saw something flicker behind his eyes, the first real fear he had seen there since this whole business began. "These are serious accusations," Colton said. "Photographs can be staged. A woman with a grudge against me for buying her husband's worthless claim might have reason to. The claim was never worthless, Edith said, cutting him off with a coldness that silenced the room. You knew that, Mr. Colton, or you would never have wanted it. My husband died on that mountain 2 years ago, and I have wondered every day since whether the slide that killed him was as natural as everyone told me. I do not have proof of that, not yet. But I have proof enough of this. And she tapped the forged lien, and I intend to see the circuit judge examine every page of it, along with whatever these gentlemen care to bring forward about their missing cattle. The council meeting broke up in disarray, Colton departing with 2 of his allies close behind him and murder in his eyes. But Roy noted, with grim satisfaction, that 3 of the 7 councilmen had stayed behind to talk quietly with Hollis Greer and the other small ranchers, and that none of them looked ready to vote for stripping the sheriff's badge come morning. Outside, under a sky gone violet with the last of the evening light, Roy caught Edith's arm gently before she could climb back into her wagon. You did not have to do that, he said. Walk in there and hand them everything at once. You could have saved it for the judge, kept your evidence close until you needed it most. I have spent 2 years being careful, Roy Ramsey, Edith said, and there was something fierce and alive in her face that he had not seen even on the night she had held a rifle on him. Careful did not bring my husband back. Careful did not stop Colton from putting a forged lien on my land. I decided riding home from Larkspur that I was done being careful and started being right instead, whatever it cost. It might cost you plenty if Colton decides to make you pay for it directly instead of through paper. Then I suppose, Edith said, softer now, it is a good thing I have a sheriff willing to stand between me and whatever he sends. I would stand there regardless of the badge, Roy said before he could stop himself, and watched color rise in her cheeks in the fading light. I think you know that by now. I am beginning to, Edith said, and for a moment, standing close in the violet dusk with Charlie calling impatiently from the wagon and the whole canyon holding its breath around them, Roy thought she might close the last of the distance between them. But Daniel's voice cut through the moment, calling that Mrs. Alvarez had supper ready, and the world came rushing back in, full of duty and danger and everything still unresolved, and Edith only pressed his hand once, quick and warm, before climbing up into the wagon seat beside her sons. The next several days passed in a strange, tense quiet, the golden summer weather holding steady even as the trouble underneath it thickened like storm clouds gathering behind a clear sky. Roy rode the length of the canyon collecting statements from small ranchers who had lost cattle to Colton's altered brands, building a case with the patient, careful thoroughness of a man who understood that half-proof against a man like Colton was worse than no proof at all. Edith, for her part, made 3 separate trips out to Widow's Bend with her camera, photographing the claim boundaries in careful detail, the cottonwood roots where Charlie had made his find, the growing pile of gravel where Daniel and Charlie together had begun, under careful supervision, to work the claim properly with pan and rocker, pulling out enough color each day to convince even the skeptical that this was no fluke. It was on one of these trips, working the plates in the light, tight tent she carried for the purpose, that Edith found Roy waiting for her when she emerged, having ridden out unannounced to check on the family's safety. You did not need to come all this way, she said, though the smile that crossed her face said otherwise. Beckwith can mind the office for an afternoon, Roy said. I wanted to see the claim for myself, and I wanted to see you. They walked together along the creek bank, while Charlie and Daniel worked the rocker further downstream, the water running low and clear and gold-flecked in the afternoon light. And Roy found himself telling her things he had not told anyone in years, about his brother's death, about the loneliness of holding a badge in a town where half the people who smiled at you were only smiling because they were afraid of you, about how tired he had grown of being careful too, in his own way. Careful never to want anything too much, because wanting things had a way of giving other men leverage over him. I have not wanted anything this much in a long while, he admitted, watching her rather than the water. Wanting a case to come out right, wanting a town to be honest, He stopped himself, but Edith had gone still beside him, listening. Wanting what, Roy? She said quietly. Wanting to know if there is room in whatever life you are building for yourself and your boys, for a lawman who might not have a badge much longer, and who has nothing much to offer you but himself. Edith was quiet for a long moment, watching the water. I built a life once around a man I loved, she said finally. I lost him to this canyon and it near broke me. I have spent 2 years telling myself I would never let myself need anybody that much again, that I would keep my camera and my boys and my own 2 hands and that would be enough. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears. But I find myself wanting to be foolish again, Roy Ramsey, wanting it more than I have wanted anything since Tom died, and I am frightened half to death by how much I want it. I am not asking you to stop being who you are, Roy said, closing the distance between them at last, close enough that he could see the small gold flecks in her own eyes, the same color as the creek beside them. I do not want a wife who puts down her camera to keep my house, Edith. I have watched you these past weeks. You are the bravest, most capable person I have met in this canyon, man or woman, and I would be a fool and a tyrant both to ask you to be anything less than exactly what you already are. Then what are you asking? Edith whispered. I am asking if you might let me stand beside you instead of in front of you, Roy said. Whatever comes next with Colton, whatever it costs either of us. I am asking if there is room for both our lives to fit together, instead of one of us folding up to make space for the other. Edith answered him not with words but by closing the last small distance between them herself, and when Roy kissed her, careful and slow at first and then not so careful at all, he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since his brother's grave, some old restless grief finally finding a place to lay itself down to rest. They broke apart when Charlie's voice came hollering up the bank that he had found another good-sized nugget, and Edith laughed, breathless and bright, resting her forehead against Roy's chest for one more moment before duty called them both back to the world. This is not finished, she said. Colton will not simply let this go. No, Roy agreed. I do not expect he will, but whatever comes, we will meet it together now. I mean that plain, Edith, together. He did not know, standing there in that gold afternoon light with her warm against him and the creek singing over its stones, how soon and how violently that promise would be tested. The trouble came 8 days later, on a night so dry and still that every rancher in the canyon had been watching the sky with a wary eye, for it had not rained in nearly a month, and the grass on the high slopes had gone the color of old straw, brittle and dangerous. Roy was roused from sleep in his room above the sheriff's office by Beckwith pounding on the door, white-faced and breathless. Fire, Roy, up past Widow's Bend on the ridge above the Maddox place. Somebody's seen the glow from town. Roy was in his boots and on his horse within minutes, and what he saw as he crested the last rise before the Maddox homestead stopped his heart cold in his chest. The whole ridge above the creek was burning, a wall of orange light eating its way down through dry grass and brush faster than any man could outrun on foot, driven by a hot, dry wind that had come up out of nowhere in the last hour. And below it, in the yard of the homestead, Edith was already working desperately to hitch her team to the wagon while Daniel herded the family's few head of stock toward the road, and Charlie ran back and forth with buckets of water, throwing them uselessly against a barn roof that had no hope of surviving what was coming. "Leave it," Roy shouted, swinging down from his horse and grabbing Charlie by the shoulders before the boy could dash back for another bucket. "Leave the barn, there is no saving it. We have got to get everybody clear now, all of you, before that fire reaches the road." "The claim papers," Edith was saying, half wild with the effort of controlling 2 terrified horses. "And the photographs, Roy, 2 years of plates, I cannot leave them." "You can leave anything that is not breathing," Roy said, taking the reins from her hands with a firmness that brooked no argument, though his voice stayed gentle. "I will not lose you to a box of glass for all the gold in that creek bed. Get Charlie up on the wagon seat. Now, Edith." She obeyed, for once without argument, some deep instinct for survival overriding even her fierce independence. And Roy got the team moving down the rutted track toward the bridge, even as the fire crested the ridge behind them with a roar like a train, sparks and burning debris beginning to rain down around them despite the distance, carried on that terrible dry wind. They were not the only family fleeing. As they reached the main canyon road, Roy saw a dozen other wagons and riders converging from up and down the valley. The Alvarez family, the Greers, half a dozen small holdings that lay in the fire's likely path, all of them streaming toward the one bridge that offered any real escape from the canyon before the fire could trap them against the gorge with no way across. It was there, at the bridgehead, that Roy found Enos Pratt, and understood in one terrible instant exactly how this fire had started. Pratt was soot-streaked and wild-eyed, trying to control a horse gone half-mad with fear of the smoke, and when he saw Roy his face went through fear and defiance, and something that might almost have been shame before settling on a kind of desperate bravado. "Wind came up wrong," Pratt shouted over the growing chaos. "Was not supposed to spread this far." Mr. Colton only wanted the assay records burned, the ledgers he kept up at the line shack, wanted it to look like an accident so nobody would ever prove what was in them. But the wind, he stopped himself. But it was too late, and Roy saw the same understanding dawn on the faces of half a dozen ranchers close enough to have heard him. "You set this fire," Roy said, cold fury cutting through the panic of the moment. "You set it to burn evidence, and it has near burned this whole canyon down around us instead." "I did not mean for it to spread like this," Pratt said, and for the first time Roy heard real terror in his voice, not of Roy or the law, but of the fire itself, now roaring down the ridge toward the bridge from two directions at once as the wind whipped it into a churning wall of flame that lit the whole gorge orange, and threw a heat Roy could feel from 100 yards off. "Colton said it would look natural, said nobody would ever know. I only did what he told me." There was no time to arrest him, not with the bridge itself now in danger, its wooden deck old and dry as tinder, sparks already catching in the brush at its near end. Roy made a decision in the space of a single breath, and shouted for every wagon and rider to get across now, immediately, no waiting, no arguing, and set about it himself, pulling frightened horses by their bridles when their owners' hands shook too badly to manage it, lifting children bodily up onto wagon seats, shouting names and directions over the roar of the approaching flame. Edith, rather than fleeing across with her own family first, turned her wagon crosswise at the near end of the bridge and began directing the other families across in order, calm as a woman conducting a church social, her voice cutting clear and steady through the chaos in a way that settled panicking horses faster than any amount of shouting could have. "The Greers first. Their wagon is heaviest and slowest. Then the Alvarez family, then anyone on horseback. You can move fast if the deck starts to go. Roy, get the far end lanterns lit so folks can see their footing once they are across. It is going black as pitch over there with the smoke." Roy did as she said without question, some part of him marveling even in the terror of the moment at how naturally command sat on her, how the fear in her voice never once cracked her judgment. The fire reached the near bank of the gorge just as the last wagon, the Greers' heavy freight wagon groaning under its load, cleared the bridge deck, and Roy watched with his heart in his throat as flame licked at the dry timber of the bridgehead itself, the whole structure beginning to smoke and smolder even as 3 riders still waited to cross, among them Enos Pratt, whose horse had finally thrown him in its panic and bolted, leaving him afoot at the worst possible moment. "Roy." Edith's voice, sharp with warning, and Roy turned to see Pratt scrambling up from the dirt, his leg twisted wrong beneath him, unable to run, the fire cresting the last rise not 80 yards distant. Every instinct told Roy to leave him, this man who had lied and framed and finally set a fire that had nearly killed a dozen families, but some deeper part of him, the part that had put on a badge in the first place to be better than the men who had let his brother die unanswered, would not let him. He ran back onto the smoking bridge deck, felt the boards hot and soft beneath his boots, got his shoulder under Pratt's arm and half dragged, half carried him the last stretch across even as the timbers behind them began to fully catch, the whole structure lighting up like a torch not 30 seconds after their boots hit solid ground on the far side. Edith was there to catch Roy as he stumbled the last few steps, both of them coughing in the smoke, watching the bridge that had determined the fate of every family in this canyon for a decade collapse in a shower of sparks into the gorge below. "You fool man," Edith said, half laughing and half sobbing with the release of terror, her hands running over him checking for burns with a thoroughness that made his heart ache with tenderness even in the midst of the disaster. "You absolute fool, running back onto a burning bridge for a man who tried to burn your evidence and steal a child's gold claim out from under him." "I am a lawman," Roy said, hoarse from smoke. "Even for men who do not deserve it, I could not just watch him burn, Edith. I would not have been able to live with myself, or with you, if I had left him there." "I know," Edith said, and pressed her face against his soot-streaked shoulder for one long moment before pulling back to attend to Pratt's leg, calling for someone to bring water and cloth, her practical courage reasserting itself even in the middle of a disaster. Pratt, laid out on a blanket with his leg splinted rough and ready, broke entirely once the immediate danger had passed, the shock and terror of nearly dying stripping away whatever loyalty he had left to Silas Colton. "He killed Tom Maddox," Pratt said, staring up at the smoke-hazed stars, his voice raw. 2 years back. Wanted that Sentinel claim cheap. Knew there was color in it if a man dug deep enough. Hired me to loosen the shoring on that shaft so it would look like natural rock. I never meant for anybody to die, I swear it. I only thought it would scare them off the claim, but Tom Maddox would not scare. And then the whole face came down on him before I could call it off. He was weeping now, whether from the pain of his leg or the weight of his confession, Roy could not tell. And when the boy found gold at Widow's Bend, Colton panicked, could not risk anybody digging too close into how he came to own the Sentinel claim so cheap after Maddox died there. So he had me plant that steer, forge that lien, anything to run the family off before questions started getting asked. The fire tonight, that was meant to burn the line shack ledgers where he kept the real brand counts, make it look like a grass fire got out of hand naturally. I did not know the wind would turn the way it did." Edith had gone very still beside Roy, her hand finding his in the darkness and gripping hard enough to hurt, and Roy understood that whatever grief and suspicion she had carried for 2 years about her husband's death had just been confirmed in the worst possible way, in the mouth of a dying fire on the far side of a collapsed bridge, with half the canyon's families gathered around listening. "You will answer for this," Roy said to Pratt, his voice steady though his own hands were not quite steady at all. "Every bit of it in front of the judge on the record, the same words you just said to me. I do not much care what happens to me now," Pratt said. "I have got nothing left Colton did not already take. Might as well tell it true for once in my life. The fire burned itself out against the bare rock of the upper ridges by dawn, having done its worst damage to grazing land and one collapsed bridge, but claiming, by the mercy of the golden calm weather that had held before that terrible night, not a single human life. The canyon families camped together on the safe side of the gorge through what remained of the night, sharing blankets and coffee, and the particular closeness that comes from having survived something terrible side by side. And it was there, in the gray hour before proper sunrise, that word reached them. A rider had been sent for the circuit judge that very night by Ferris Yates, shamed into decisive action by nearly losing his own family to a fire set to hide a rich man's crimes. The weeks that followed moved fast, the way things do once a dam finally breaks after being held too long against too much pressure. The circuit judge, a dry, precise man named Wexford, arrived in Gideon's Crossing within the week and heard testimony that took 3 full days to unfold. Enos Pratt's confession, given a second time under oath, this time with a lawyer appointed to advise him, sworn to and consistent in every particular. Edith's photographs entered as evidence of the altered brands, the threatening confrontation at Widow's Bend, and the forged lien document. Testimony from Holly's Greer and 6 other small ranchers about years of cattle shortfalls that traced, brand by brand, back to Colton's operation. And finally, most damning of all, the recovered line shack ledger, singed but legible, which Roy himself had ridden up to retrieve from the burned ruin 2 days after the fire, its pages showing in Colton's own hand a careful, cold accounting of exactly how many cattle had been diverted from which small ranchers, tally over exactly which years. Silas Colton did not go quietly. He hired the best lawyer money could bring up from Denver, argued that Pratt's confession was the ravings of a man desperate to escape his own guilt, that the ledger proved nothing that could not be explained by ordinary ranching accounting. But Judge Wexford was not a man easily swayed by expensive lawyers, and the weight of testimony, physical evidence, and Edith's careful, dated photographs proved more than the syndicate's money could overcome. Colton was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the destruction of property by fire, and though the harder charge of murder in Tom Maddox's death could not be proven beyond Pratt's word alone, the judge made clear in his ruling that he found the confession credible and ordered restitution paid to Edith Maddox from Colton's seized assets equal to the value of the Sentinel claim, purchased so far below its worth 2 years before. Enos Pratt, for his cooperation and confession, received a lighter sentence than he might otherwise have, 5 years in the territorial prison rather than a longer term, and left the courtroom, Roy thought, looking more relieved than afraid, a man finally free of a debt to Colton that had been crushing him for years. The forged lien on the Maddox homestead was struck from the record entirely. The gold claim at Widow's Bend, formally registered in Charlie Maddox's name with Edith as his guardian, was confirmed clean and clear, and word of it had by then spread far enough that a proper assay office had been established in Gideon's Crossing itself, no longer requiring any family to cross a bridge, rebuilt now with county funds and Colton's own seized money, to have their gold weighed and valued fairly. The town council, chastened and considerably reshuffled, once 3 of its members were revealed to have known more about Colton's schemes than they had ever admitted, voted unanimously to confirm Roy Ramsey as sheriff for a full new term, this time funded not by any single rancher's purse, but by a proper town levy that owed no man any particular favor. It was on a warm evening in late August, the canyon gold with late summer light, and the new bridge freshly rebuilt with strong new timber that smelled of pine sap and promise, that Roy rode out to the Maddox homestead one last time, not on official business, but simply because he could not stay away. He found Edith on the porch where he had first seen her, rifle nowhere in sight now, her camera instead set up nearby capturing the last light on the ridge where the fire had burned, the black scars already softening under a fresh green fuzz of new grass pushing up through the ash, nature's own patient proof that even the worst burning ground could grow again. "I have been thinking," Roy said, dismounting and coming to sit on the porch step beside her, "about what you said that day at the creek about wanting to be foolish again." "Have you?" Edith said, a smile already tugging at her mouth. "I have got no gold of my own to offer you," Roy said. "Only a badge that a town levy now pays for honestly, and a house in town that needs a woman's touch, and a heart that has been yours, I think, since you pointed a rifle at me and told me to prove myself worthy of your trust." "That is not nothing, Roy Ramsey," Edith said softly. "That is a great deal more than most men have ever offered me." "I am not asking you to give up this," Roy said, gesturing to the camera, the tripod, the careful evidence of the life she had built with her own 2 hands. "I spoke to the town council. They are looking to commission a proper photographic record of the county, for the land office, for the new school, for whatever comes next as this canyon grows. I told them there is only one photographer within 100 miles skilled enough and brave enough for the work, and that she keeps her own hours and her own eye for what is worth capturing and what is not. I would build you a proper darkroom off the house in town, if you would let me, someplace with good north light for your printing, and I would learn to live around your travels the way you would have to learn to live around mine, because I do not intend to stop being sheriff of this canyon, not now that the badge finally means what I always hoped it could. Edith set down the plate she had been holding, careful of its fragile surface even now, and turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with something that was not smoke or grief this time, but pure, unguarded joy. "You are asking me to marry you," she said, "and offering me a darkroom in the same breath, which I believe may be the most practical proposal any woman in this territory has ever received." "I have never been a man for pretty speeches," Roy admitted, "only for meaning what I say. I love you, Edith Maddox. I loved you before I understood it, standing in your yard with a rifle pointed at my chest, thinking I had never in my life seen anybody so entirely herself. I would be honored, more than I know how to say, if you would let me stand beside you for whatever comes next, for both our sakes and your boys besides." Edith answered him the way she had answered him once before, by closing the distance between them herself, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw, and when she kissed him this time, there was no fire threatening on the ridge above them, no lie hanging over either of their heads, only the wide gold evening and the sound of Charlie and Daniel's laughter drifting up from the creek where they were still, 3 months on, finding color enough in that once-abandoned bend to secure their family's future for years to come. "Yes," Edith said, when they finally broke apart, both of them a little breathless, a little disbelieving of their own good fortune. "Yes, Roy Ramsey, I will marry you, and I will keep my camera besides, and you will keep your badge. And between the two of us I expect we will manage to build something neither one of us could have built alone." They were married 3 weeks later in the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, the whole canyon turning out for the occasion. Holly's Greer and the other small ranchers who had gotten their stolen cattle counted and returned standing as proud witnesses. Mrs. Alvarez weeping happy tears through the whole short ceremony, Daniel standing straight and solemn as best man at 16 going on some far older age after everything the summer had put him through, and Charlie, grinning ear to ear in a new suit bought with a small, careful portion of his own gold, presenting the ring on a little velvet cushion he had insisted on making himself. Edith wore, at her own insistence, a simple dress rather than anything grand, and carried, tucked into her bouquet, a single small glass plate photograph, the very first one she had taken at Widow's Bend the morning after Charlie's discovery, a record of the moment everything in her life had begun to change for the better. Roy stood at the front of that little schoolhouse in his good coat with his badge polished and pinned proper to his chest, and thought, watching her walk toward him down that short aisle with the gold afternoon light pouring through the windows, that he had never in all his years as a lawman felt so entirely, gratefully certain of anything as he felt certain of her. Widow's Bend, in the years that followed, would come to be known simply as the Maddox strike, its gold providing enough for the family's comfort without ever swelling into the kind of fortune that might have changed who they were at their core. And Edith kept right on photographing the canyon exactly as she had promised, her wagon becoming a familiar and welcome sight on every road from Gideon's Crossing to Larkspur and beyond. Her collection of plates growing year by year into what the county recorder would one day call the finest visual record of the territory's early settlement anywhere to be found. Roy served as sheriff for many years after, honest to the badge in every particular, never again beholden to any man's purse but the town's own, and if there were harder days ahead, droughts and disputes and the ordinary troubles of a growing frontier settlement, he faced them always with Edith beside him, not behind him and not in front, exactly as he had promised her that gold afternoon at the creek, two people who had found in each other. After fire and fraud and one small boy's astonishing luck, the truest kind of wealth this rough and beautiful canyon had ever offered up to anybody brave enough to go looking for it.